Route to Power, and it will talk about decades of unwavering journalism, journalism at the Herald and Newsline. Let me introduce our panel and then just a few words about the state of journalism today. On our panel, we have Rehman Saab, who needs no introduction. Everyone knows Rehman Saab's columns in Dawn. Journalist, activist, former Secretary General of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. We have Tehmina Ahmed, who worked as Senior Assistant Editor at Newsline. We have Zahid Hussain, author of Scorpion's Tale, journalist, who also was associated with Herald and Newsline. And we have Talat Aslam, the Senior Editor at the News currently, and was at the Herald as well. Just for everyone here, the Herald and Newsline were political monthly magazines that were recently shut down last year. So we'll talk a bit about why that happened. But before we go on, just to let everyone know, I thought I would just update you very briefly, and it's not possible to do that in just like a minute, on the state of journalism in Pakistan today. It's depressing. Pakistan ranks 8th on the Committee to Protect Journalists 2019 Global Immunity Index, with 16 unsolved killings of journalists in the past 10 years. Of the 34 journalists who were murdered for their work since 1992, and CPJ, which is a New York-based organization, keeps detailed records of journalists, how many are killed, attacks against journalists. And they say that partial justice has only been achieved in 3 cases. Recently, we know that Aziz Maymon, a journalist who worked in Sindh, was killed on February 17th. He worked for KTN News and Daily Khwahish, which are Sindhi newspaper. He circulated a video earlier on Twitter and said that he was being threatened by a prominent political party in Sindh. We also know about the strict social media laws that were passed on January 28th. So just very briefly, that's the state of journalism in Pakistan today. Because this session has been titled Decades of Unwavering Journalism, let's begin by reminiscing a bit about the past. I too worked at the Herald for 3 years as a senior assistant editor. And I came from broadcast to print, and the reason why I'm very briefly talking about that is because when you're in broadcast, you do the 24/7 news cycle. And then I came to print, and I learned a lot. And it was really very interesting, my experience, because, you know, I did long-form journalism as well. But, you know, it no longer sells. So let's start with Rehman Saab contributed columns to both the Herald and the Newsline, as he does Dawn recently. Let's start with Rehman Saab first and then move down. Rehman Saab, talk a bit about your experience as a columnist, as a journalist, writing ever since the inception of Herald and then Newsline, and the challenges that you faced at the time. And then we'll move on to challenges in the current period. But just reminisce a bit about the past. We'll get everyone to do that, and then we'll move on to the current state of journalism.
Thank you very much. When I started writing for Herald, the only challenge was to be yourself. See? To write honestly and try to do one's best. And the external challenges were not there so much as the challenges of expression, challenges of investigation, challenges. And in fact, I personally not only wrote for Herald, but I grew up with Herald. You see, I was not a born columnist. I learned to write a column while contributing to Herald. And over a period of time, you know, Herald became the acme of periodical journalism in Pakistan.
At the time when I was an intern at the Herald, I was only about 15 years old. I remember very briefly, and Sherry Rehman was the editor, and she once told me, you know, Herald breaks news. You can't even think of it now. I mean, a print magazine breaking news.
But I would like to say that in those days, although we had authoritarian regimes, you know, but authoritarian regimes have been becoming more and more authoritarian over time. So I must say there was more space for us in those days than there is in today.
But when you say space, there were also the blank spaces and the censorship.
The space you mean, you know,
I mean literally.
By space you mean if you wrote boldly and courageously, you knew what would happen to you, which was not very much. That you will be served with a notice, you might be arrested, you might be tried, and that's all. Today, one has to think about many more horrendous situations.
We'll talk about those in just a minute.
There was some respect for law. Today there is no respect for law.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back to that when we talk about the state of journalism currently. I'm coming to Newsline in just a minute, but I'm going to get done with the Herald, so I'm going to jump to you, Tito. Talat, do you want to talk a bit about your experience at the Herald, and also tell us, the early days of the Herald, because, for me, I've heard all those anecdotes. I obviously came much later to the Herald, but you can explain, the early days and how important that the magazine was.
Okay. Actually, it's difficult to imagine how much impact publication. It's difficult to imagine how much impact something like a magazine, a monthly magazine, made in those days, but it used to really make a huge impact, and it certainly changed my life because I'd studied abroad, and when I came back, I was at a loose end. I didn't know what to do with myself, and I managed to get into Herald, and it was an all-women's magazine, and apart from Zahid...
Very interesting. You could talk about that.
Apart from Zahid and myself, there were everyone else was women. All our bosses were women, and it was interesting. It was totally a different learning experience.
And we were talking earlier, even in Zahid Saab, a lot of very senior journalists and journalists who came to the Herald and Newsline cut their teeth there, both publications, and they went on to do other stuff in the media, whether that was broadcast media or big things actually.
Mm-hmm.
How did Herald and Newsline achieve that? Because they were print magazines, Zahid Saab?
I joined Herald 1983 when it was changing to new format, and it was based accidentally rather. I was in Europe, and I happened to interview Bani Sadr and Masood Rajavi. Bani Sadr was the president of Iran, and he fled. He had just fled to France, and I interviewed him, and I sent it to Herald. And when I came back, I received a call from Razia Bhatti, would you like to join Herald? I said yes.
Who was at the Herald at the time?
Razia Bhatti was the editor. When I joined Herald, I was the only token male there, surrounded by 5 strong women, and I think...
Who were the 5 strong women?
Razia was the editor, Rehana Hakim, then Saira Irshad, Samina Ibrahim, Amne Azam Ali, how can I forget her? Yeah, so basically these were and I was for 2 years before Tito arrived, or Talat Aslam arrived. Sorry, we call him Tito, so don't worry.
Actually, my name was Talat, and that also caused problems because people thought I was a woman. Yeah.
And I remember when we heard that somebody joining named Talat, so we were all confused.
What was
I remember actually his brother was the editor of, Imran Aslam was the editor of Star. So women actually they started asking question, how is he? Who is he? So I think probably when he arrived, so I lost my position that way.
Okay, so as we were also talking earlier, what were the challenges at the time? You were at Herald, and then you were at Newsline, and the entire team that you just mentioned, Zahid Saab, became the Newsline team later on. The women that you just mentioned, they sort of became the Newsline team. But at Herald, what were the challenges at the time? And then when you went to Newsline, you worked at both political monthlies. At the time, how different was it to be a journalist, a young journalist in the profession? What was the state of journalism like then?
Well, it was quite exciting period, I would say. That yes, that was a period when Ziaul Haq was ruling the country, and we all know actually what was the situation like. But still, actually, we managed to do a lot. being a monthly magazine at that time actually, and it was very well read, and so we got into the investigative reporting. So most of our Herald's, became known for its investigative reports. So that made Herald unique in that way. As far as the pressure is concerned, yes, there were pressure. Benazir could not have come on cover of Herald. I remember actually 85, when she was allowed to leave the country for health reasons. We wanted her to put on the cover of Herald, but we could not actually, a caricature of somebody.
Just to let the audience know, the Herald covers were just something else. They were quite interesting and very exciting.
But inside we have written everything. There has not been like, similarly actually when Benazir came back, that was the biggest story in the world that time. So still actually she was for the first time was put on a cover, surrounded by 5 irrelevant leaders.
Okay, let me interrupt you here. There was no 24-hour news cycle at the time.
Yeah.
How influential were magazines, political monthlies like the Herald, like Newsline later on? How important were they?
I think it was a different media altogether. The daily paper have less, independence or freedom. So Herald actually stood out because, all those stories. Definitely, I remember actually after every story, we used to get some kind of notice from PID, Press Information Department, not ISPR at that point. So, every time I remember actually we would come and say 50,000 fine, which was never paid, of course. So that was the thing. But I enjoyed my days with Herald and the writing in that period because it allowed us such a huge space for do more substantive, investigative report. And I think probably that has become the, the landmark of
Yes.
Herald.
And actually, even today, sorry,
No, go ahead.
Today, this the kind of stuff that was written in that period, a lot of foreign journalists and visiting scholars and things keep coming and asking us for archives, which unfortunately they don't have.
So basically, both magazines, what they have done is they have documented history,
Right.
and their archives would be very, very important. Moving on to you, Tehmina, I have a question. It is well known and documented that the older generation of journalists, when they began in this profession, when I say older, I mean the veterans, men and women, they were united under various banners, like they were united for causes like women's rights, whether that pertained or free press, they fought regressive governments. Today, you don't see that kind of unity, whether it's among media groups, whether it's among the businesses that own the media groups. There's a lot of friction and a lot of fissures. I mean, how difficult was it then when you were there at Newsline, and how would you compare it today with the 24/7 news cycle? Because Newsline was then later bought over by a media conglomerate.
Much later. We were actually independent for 25 years.
How different was that then
Yeah.
and now when you were bought over?
But your other question, I think at that time when I started out, I came to journalism through activism, actually. I was with the Women's Action Forum in the early 80s, and that's how I got interested in writing. I actually was in advertising at the time. I was a copywriter, and I began to freelance and writing on women's issues. And I was at the Herald very briefly. So for me, Newsline was the real experience, and I think the important thing there was that we were absolutely independent. We had no model to follow. We had very few resources, but we had an incredible amount of goodwill, and I think that's what...
And you had a lot of women journalists working there as well.
Yes,
you were you are extremely strong women who held the fort for many, many years, like you say, 25 years, and then you were bought over. Can you talk a bit about the period when you were absolutely independent compared to, and then the closing down?
Actually, I wouldn't say that there was a huge difference in terms of editorial policy because fortunately or unfortunately, the people who bought us over didn't really have time to think about what was going on at Newsline. So we carried on more or less in the same vein. But we had, at the time when we went into a merger, we had hoped that our weak point has always been business, because we were journalists, we were more into the business of writing rather than the business of selling, that perhaps we would balance that out in some way, but unfortunately it didn't happen. Also, as you said, it's just a changing media scene.
Okay, Rehman Sahab, I'm going to move to you with a question. What was it? What was it that you went through as a journalist that the younger generation might not be able to handle today? What kind of forces or what kind of challenges face the younger generation of journalists today, the journalists that are cutting their teeth on digital media platforms, even broadcast media? I mean, are there a different set of challenges? Do we have the same actors that are enforcing regressive policies, that are enforcing some kind of self-censorship that we constantly hear about? What is the difference between your generation and the generation now?
My experience of writing for Herald was that the fine women Razestha Sethna mentioned, they were somewhat different journalists.
In what way?
They were thrilled, by their work. They had not fallen into the routine of journalism that you find elsewhere. Secondly, they were in competition.
With who?
They were in competition because newspapers also were publishing magazines.
Right.
So publishing a monthly magazine which will remain fresh, coming after 1 month or month later. So this was a great challenge for them. And that is why they concentrated on digging the truth, investigation. And sometimes in the process of investigation, they forgot the challenges they faced, the toes they tread on. So they could take on the government, they could take on Ziaul-Haq, they could take on the drug peddlers, they could take on the dacoits of sin, you see, because they found it so exciting and extremely talented. Many of them did not have time to prove their talent fully, like Azam Ali, brilliant journalist, brilliant writer, died very young. So, the challenge that now we face.
Yes, and compare them, like you were talking to me earlier outside.
You see, there was a difference between Herald and Newsline, because Herald was backed by the leading media organization.
The Dawn Media Group.
And except for a moment or two, they stood up to everybody. And they gave them full backing. They went on investing in it. On the other hand, Newsline did not have those resources. It was the team spirit, it was the spirit of sacrifice, a commitment to go on doing something. And Razia Bhatti played a leading role while editing Herald, and she played a leading role even while she was dead.
Razia Bhatti, just to let our audience know, was the editor.
Because they had to keep up.
Yes.
They had to keep up that tradition. And as far as regards today, the challenges are that, as I said earlier on, the society has become more timid. The authoritarian regime has become more authoritarian. And journalists do not have anybody to look for.
What do you mean by that?
Which is, if nobody will come to the aid of journalists when they are strung up.
Why? Because there's no unity amongst media bosses, amongst editors.
Because
what's the problem?
People have been alienated from everything. People have been alienated. I consider it a pity that both Herald and Newsline, in my humble opinion, were national institutions.
Yes.
They should have been recognized as such.
Could they, just let me ask, come back to you, Zahid Saab and Tito, and please,
See,
anyone...
business ignored them. society ignored them.
But Rehman Sahib, if they could have been
The
saved,
government did not shed a single tear when they were closed, and the society also did not offer any fatiha.
could both magazines have been saved? Could both magazines have been saved if there was some kind of content innovation and some kind of amalgamation with a digital media platform, something along the lines of, it sounds ambitious, but something along the lines of, say, how the New Yorker does it, because they are also a magazine that has
Actually, the one thing that we used to think about a lot, even 25, 30 years ago, was that a monthly news magazine is really some sort of anachronism. It has to become at least a fortnightly or a weekly, and we kept talking about it, but it never really
in your time.
happened. Even in our time,
Okay.
we were
Zaid Saab,
constantly-
you have something to say?
Well, actually, yes. I think probably, probably at that point of time, it still worked, because then we focused much more on the investigative report. But I agree with that actually, because it had started losing its value or its utility as the new media started coming in. So I think at one point, whatever was published in Herald or Newsline was seen as the very authoritative content. And I think best thing, as you said, what made Herald and Newsline unique is that the editorial control, and actually factually, and we wanted to be factually correct for everything. It was not sensationalism that way. We did actually a lot of stories which ruffled many ways. But one thing is that we were very particular about that things should be fact, and it should be, and both sides or in the story should be covered. And I think I remember Razia was very perfectionist. And Tito would also remember actually in the Herald, we used to work actually last 1 week before it was sent to the press. We spent nights and nights and editing stories.
Yes,
and she was such a perfectionist. I remember I did, I think it was 1986. There was an incident in Gadoon in KP now, where farmers were killed, about 22 of them. I flew to that area, did a story, and came back. So Razia, so I started from the morning, Azan, Fajr, Azan happened, and then Razia was, and I wrote something actually about, it was 5:30 in the morning. But Razia was actually insistent, no, we should have exact time of Fajr at that point, and it took about 2 or 3 hours actually just to find out when the Fajr started. So that kind of,
the fact checking. I think that went on right till the end, because when I was there also, I think.
And also
but
one
that
thing more
teaches
actually
you
about Herald and other thing, which is basically historical, very important. Like for example, rise of MQM.
Yes.
And I think we went issue after issue. We wrote about the social, economic factors which gave rise to the MQM. Myself, Amne Azam Ali.
What was the, sorry to interrupt.
Arif Hassan. And if you go through, if really somebody wants to write a book on MQM, you should go to all
that was when Sherry
issues of
Rehman
Herald.
was the editor. What was the backlash from the MQM at the time? Because Altaf Hussein's line was that those journalists who wrote what he didn't like would be in bori bags, dead. So what was
actually, it was quite dramatic, because actually, funnily enough, I was kind of, if you like, shadowed by the MQM, because my first day in journalism was the day Bushra Zaidi was killed in an accident, which is what set off the violence in Karachi way back in 1984-85.
Want to come closer to the mic?
84-85. And from that day onward, because we were based in Karachi, Herald and then later Newsline found it really difficult functioning, because the MQM in its heyday was quite a scary force, yeah. And we used to literally go out of the office, because we used to work late at night, we used to go home, deserted streets, because Karachi was often having troubles, and we used to go home in a convoy, because it was not very
So those were the
sincere.
challenges then, right?
Yes, very scary.
But it's interesting enough actually, like MQM, we've written a lot actually criticizing, attacking and exposing them on the, but, and they were also surprised sometimes. But when 92 military operation
Yes, yeah.
started against
Yes.
them, and we wrote against the military operation.
Yeah.
So in a way actually they at least they are also understood and realized
Exactly.
that we are not just after MQM,
Yes.
but we,
So when the military went after the MQM and there were human rights abuses, Herald reported
That's
that
what
as
they
well.
did. Wrote
So
lots
so
of it.
basically reporting without fear and favor, and that is why the Herald. I mean, personally, I think that is why the Herald survived, and the quality of the long-form journalism, like you rightly said, you know, it is something that is like documenting history. I have a question, I mean, for anybody to answer. Rehman Sahab, maybe you could have a go at that. Given the state of journalism in the past 5 to 8 years, would it be fair to say that it's not just censorship or even self-censorship, or we keep harping about even the lack of freedom that are responsible for the decline in quality journalism? I mean, could it be the absence of well-researched stories, reports on human rights violations? Could it be like journalism itself is losing some kind of intensity and some kind of passion that we saw when your generation was very much there? I mean, do you feel that?
See, the process of degeneration that has been going on in Pakistan for such a long time has not left journalism also unscathed. See? The point is, I'll tell you one incident, you know. Herald was opposing the government that was overthrown by General Zia-ul-Haq. And so he was very happy and he invited all of them to Islamabad. See? That since they were criticizing the people's government, they should be counted on my side. When they arrived and I met them and they came back and told him that we are nobody's fool. You know? That when they said that we are opposed to all regimes, not only People's Party but also you. so this was something that Zia-ul-Haq did not expect, but he took time to retaliate. He took time to retaliate, not immediately. So that was the spirit, you know. Secondly, there was some respect for law. You see, they will make bad laws and then prosecute you. Now the situation is that there is no law. I can give you so many examples, you know.
Give us some examples.
Somebody telephones somebody, a proprietor, and tells him that so-and-so is not entitled to work anymore. So he gets sacked immediately. And next day when he goes to the office is closed. He or she is not even allowed to go into the room and collect his belongings. What law is there? In cantonments, you know, a daily newspaper is not distributed. Under what law? There is no law. And then, you know, Pakistan has become a very unsafe country for journalists. How many have been killed? And how many cases have been registered? And how many have been convicted? Only one. And that is also pending.
The Wali Babur case.
Yeah, that is also pending. So this is the situation, and this has made people think of their families, you know. We never thought of our families in those days.
Rehman Sahab, you write very boldly. You're very bold and courageous. Your columns in Dawn, you still say what you need to say. How have you survived?
I have to think twice. I do not want to be the cause of any harm to the paper I am writing for. See, there is official censorship of a level never seen before. There is self-censorship. The editors censor themselves, the writers censor themselves. And I'm afraid of talking to you because I don't know what the result will be. So we have stopped talking to ourselves. So this is in this situation. Fortunately, people are realizing this, and we are making an effort, efforts. Organizations, our supporters in the other professions, The other day, 2 meetings were held, one in Islamabad, one in Lahore, in which the journalists and politicians and lawyers came together and put our heads down and said, if this is the state of social media that the rules framed by the honorable government shows, then there will be no discourse in Pakistan, there will be no ideas in Pakistan. This will be a cesspool of politicians' speeches and nothing more. They want to close down WhatsApp, they want to close down Google, they want to drive out. This is totally unacceptable. So I think, my only hope is that we are fighting for the people. And the people should realize that it is their right we are trying to defend, not our own.
In this atmosphere, as you describe, of self-censorship and of regressive measures and laws, how is journalism expected to sort of not only improve, but survive, improve? You attract and draw a generation that wants to get into a particular profession. Tehmina, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you get the younger generation and tell them that, it's not as bad as it seems?
Well, to come back to your previous question, could Herald and Newsline have been saved if there was content innovation? Perhaps to an extent, but I think, if the changes were so drastic that they became something else and you lost your strengths, which were basically the long-form journalism, the analysis, the credibility, would it be worth it? I'm not really that sure.
Well, I mean, if you evolve over time, if you're asking me that, you evolve over time. If you read a story online now, whether it's reportage on LLF or anything, at the end of every story now, it's like a 6-minute read or a 5-minute read.
Yeah.
And then you do have long form. It's not like long form is completely eliminated or dismissed. There is that kind of investigative long form journalism. Dawn does that. World Over, The Guardian does that.
Yeah.
The New York Times does that.
So
So
you
you
do
do
a
have
combination.
that. You survive side by side, I'm assuming.
I think we do have to understand and accept that attention spans have changed very drastically, over generations. I think the mind is wired differently. So yes, it does.
I mean, everyone is living on WhatsApp and breaking news on Twitter. So if you're working on WhatsApp and you're breaking news on Twitter, what is the use then of a monthly magazine that you get in your hands? You've got to sort of evolve. The magazine literally, like you say, it may lose a bit of its ethos, but to survive, it may need to do that, because otherwise how? It's like a catch-22.
I think there was a problem with frequency, as Talat also mentioned, because we also had those discussions for a long time. Should we go weekly or whatever? So it had to go, I think, one way or the other. Maybe it should be not even a monthly, it could have been a quarterly with that kind of weight, possibly. But yes, to get to the younger generation, you have to be much snappier.
Talat, what are your thoughts on that? Because you are at the news, you're a senior editor there, and you've been there a long time. I mean, I've seen newsprint, the newspaper has lost the number of pages that it has. The kinds of stories that you had resources to do are no longer available. Everything is a snap story. Even an interview is a 3-question interview. I mean, I don't enjoy doing that. But that is how it is, because attention spans, like Tehmina said, are no longer the way they used to be. So what are your thoughts? What is the situation like now? And what is the remedy? Like I even asked
I
Rehman
really think it's sad, but as someone who's been in print media all his life, I feel very strongly that I don't think journalism of that sort, whether print or not, can just die off, because I notice a lot of the stuff that comes on social media is very dependent on what someone somewhere, some real journalist out there on print or on television, somewhere, is producing some news. Otherwise, it's all cut-paste then, yeah? There has to be someone bringing out original news, which is being professionally edited by professional editors. How it comes out, that's another question, and I'm not really sure,
Zaid Saab, coming to you, what, like we're talking about censorship, we're talking about self-censorship. You've just finished writing a book. You also, you're a very eminent journalist. You've been through the decades. Recently we have the PTM. You can't, PTM news is blocked out. Often now newspapers are
Can't mention it.
are getting bolder. You couldn't use PTM in an editorial. I couldn't talk about PTM writing something on the media about in 2018. What are your thoughts on whether this situation will evolve or there'll be a solution? Should journalists get together? The fact that there is no unity is also detrimental to the state of journalism in Pakistan.
Well, actually, over the years, the entire media scene has changed. As we had said earlier, that for print media, the space is shrinking because, first it was electronic media, people have actually believe much more, it's instant news. But even the newspapers have changed. Like I have written for papers outside, like I used to work on a story for several days and then file a story. But later on, actually, with the advent of electronic media and also actually the digital media, every newspaper has turned into internet edition. So you have to write for them actually, like as the situation changed. Sometime I used to file about 5 times a day. So that the whole thing was that for the next day, the newspaper, whatever comes in the newspaper, there's always actually things actually how do you keep a story live? Because people have been reading it throughout the day, people have been listening on television. So that is, it's not Pakistan alone, it's a world over. If you see actually, people remember the, Time magazine and Newsweek, and they were also a weekly news magazine. But over the years, actually, Time magazine has turned into a magazine of essays, and Newsweek has closed down. The print now it has only on the website. So it is also largely because of that. And there's a lot more pressure on newspaper. The New York Times had to change it completely. Then they're much more in-depth story, not just news. So I think that was the reason why actually that monthly news magazine has lost its utility or the impact. The second thing, I think pressure has always been there. The one period actually we have, if you can, I think after 1990s, up to say 2013, we have absolute freedom, with the kind of freedom we never had witnessed. But what we have started seeing the pressure in last few years, it's much more actually. Then actually I believe, like for example, during this period of 1990s, when this the civilian, that era or decade of civilian government, press was much more. Even this black law on the press law was abolished in 1989 during Junijah's government, and I think probably it had become much easier for any paper to come out and just to without any declaration.
Are you saying that till 2013 we didn't, the media was not in any kind of, there were no repressive tactics, or what were you just, no, you just said till 2013 we were fairly okay.
Well, actually, yes, well, actually, when we talk about freedom of press, no government and no ruler is happy when they come to power. But there was no such, still we used to write whatever we wanted to.
But there was still the pressure side, sir. The pressures were very much
came,
there.
Last days, for example, I'll tell, Musharraf period, yes, actually televisions were allowed, but as soon as he got vacant, in 2007, the crackdown started.
Exactly, I was just going to come to that, 2007 there was a huge
yes,
crackdown.
Actually that was a period when, but basically also Musharraf lost on that.
Yeah.
There were public, the protests, but even the control, he could not do it that way he wanted to.
That too, but do you recall Jio was closed down?
Yeah,
and,
but very briefly,
protests.
but what happened later on, that's what one should also go for. Jio or other TV channels were closed, but they all actually having their program on website. And people were watching it. So that's why I'm saying the limit, there's also limit to what you can do.
I agree, but then Asma Shirazi and Hamid Mir also did their programs outside in the open air.
That's right.
If you recall at the time.
I
So
think what changed, what really made what you're saying change dramatically is that then the media got divided, and divided, not just divided as in, there was always media jealousy, but divided ideologically down the middle. So there was our media or their media, you know, kind of us and them media. And that made independent media absolutely, I mean, at the mercy of the other media, and it became very difficult, and we haven't recovered from that. Yeah.
I think worst thing happened, I'll add to one thing. How actually the situation is worse now is that the army is direct involvement in that. You know, earlier actually the press, advice would come through PID.
Yeah.
There have always been advice. Prito, you would know actually, working for a daily newspaper as well. So, but basically now it's a very different situation. It is basically ISPR has become much more powerful, and the pressure comes directly from the military. And that, it's not like, even I don't think actually this government, obviously they were quite happy if the press is suppressed. But I think probably whatever is coming from the military directly. And so military is not in power. When Ziaul Haq was in power, everybody knew that it's a military rule. But now actually it's a different situation. The military is behind the scene, and it has become much more powerful. And I think probably if you see whatever pressure or division which has come, Tito has, this is a new way of controlling press. Divide it, and I think that has happened for the first time.
Like a divide and rule, which is almost deliberate divide and rule. So as long as you keep those divisions going, you will, the military will get what they want, basically.
Like, for example, PTM, for example. PTM, when they held their rally in Islamabad, every political leader went there. And then actually, when the protests started getting, stronger and it gaining grounds, so it was military's, instruction or advice actually that nothing should be printed or telecast. Right. So this way, one can say it's more devious.
But it is also because there is more insecurity on their part, because the dissemination of information is so rapid now with social media platforms.
The limit
that, when we look back and we look at Herald actually breaking news, that sounds very strange and bizarre, because now it's social media, and that is why there is more fear on the other side. Clearly.
The instrument to control press has a limited. Like, for example, I'll just once say, I remember working for London Times and other foreign newspaper. I used to file my story through, through telex, and will go and telegraph. Somebody will be sitting there, and if they does not like the story, the story will be pulled out. So that's how it used to be controlled. But now actually, you are not dependent on those telegraphs.
You're not dependent on an editor. You're dependent on the other forces.
See, yes, I was going to point out about that, about revival. I promulgated the first press and publication ordinance. It was opposed by newspaper owners, by editors, by journalists. And all of them put together had a one-day strike, together. And Ayub Khan was obliged to change that. So this ordinance was issued second time in 63, bit mellowed down. Then throughout the 65, 66, journalists were up front. In 1968 or 69, we took out a procession in Karachi, journalists. And on the side, were politicians led by Nawab Nasrullah Khan holding garlands and telling us, आप चलिए हम आपके पीछे हैं. मुश्किल ये है कि सियासी पार्टियां हमारे पीछे रहती हैं, हमारे आगे नहीं चलने की ताकत नहीं है, खड़े होने की ताकत नहीं है. तो वो जो उसका जो मोमेंटम था, that momentum carried us through the Zia period.
You mean the support was there?
Yes.
I know we've been talking about...
And also, finally, I would like to add,
Yes.
all good things come to an end, you know. We are sorry that the paper
I was
is
just
not
going
there.
to. I was just going to ask Talat and
but-
Zahid Saab
but
and
it was great fun doing it.
Tehmina to recall some good things, because we're making it sound very depressing. But very quickly, if you could recall your, maybe an experience, a story you came across at the Herald, a cover or Newsline, something that, I don't know, that was interesting and positive, and then we open it to questions. And with us in the audience is actually Hamid Harun, who actually conceived the Herald, and that was his baby. So I feel he doesn't want to say anything or come up here, but it was his brainchild and everything. Sorry? Yes, absolutely. But it was. He kept it alive, let's put it that way. He kept it alive as long as he could keep it alive, and I saw that, and he kept it alive very well, and was very, very supportive. And I do think that when we open up, we'll get him to say something. That would be nice, because I think he is the Herald.
Well, I just want to say that the early years were very, very exciting, and I think there was a sense of achievement, things happened. So it certainly wasn't all depressing. So as Rehman Saab said, maybe it was just time.
Do you have an anecdote, Talat? Because I know you have tons and you share them on Twitter. So let's hear something.
We had a union.
Sure.
We had a union.
Mic. Do you have a mic?
There's a difference in the Herald and Newsline model. Newsline was making sacrifices. Herald's deficits were being financed by a larger media group. That media group was deliberately put under financial pressure. There wasn't, as Zahid says, and Zahid knows, he knows it as well, that it wasn't just international events, the sense of timing, the growth of news media. There was a deliberate aggression and attack on all print media by the government. And that smashed through the finances of the large media groups. And then the deficit of Herald, in Newsline's case, was different. Newsline financed its own deficits through sheer desperation and hard work. Those deficits could not be met anymore because the mother newspaper was financially endangered. So that is not just international trends. That's a deliberate attack. The journalist, as he existed in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, up to the end of Lal Masjid, and maybe into the Nawaz Sharif, Asif Zardari period as well, was no longer tolerable, acceptable to the establishment, and they would do anything to destroy it.
Yes, I did.
Rehman Saab and Zahid, you people should comment on this, but that is part of the epitaph of this periodic press.
Zahid Saab, do you want to comment?
Well, I think I agree with that because it could still be reformed if those pressures were not there. Like, for example, we were talking about there was need for restructure the whole thing. But how could it happen if a publishing house is under so much pressure, and economic pressure particularly? And I think this is a new trend that strangulate a press or to curb any kind of anti-establishment policy through financial punishment. So I think that is happening, and I absolutely agree with that. This was one of the major factors in closing down of Herald. It could have been improved, but provided that the financial situation was better. And similarly, Newsline, yes, actually I agree with that. That was a different thing altogether. The magazine was in red for many, many years, and at that point, actually, it was sold to another company, and it still actually could not survive.
Rehman Saab, would you like to make a quick comment, and then if we have any questions? Do you want to make a quick comment on
No,
what?
I would say that I would hold state partly responsible, considerable part responsible for the demise of these two magazines, directly. Secondly, I also feel, I was a very proud member of the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists. And this was one organization which did not accept martial law. It was one organization which told Ayub Khan, we don't accept you. It was one organization which did not accept the muzzling of the press, by purchasing of press by the government. So we were united and we stood there and we opposed it. Today I don't have that unity of the professionals. So that's my weakness. As I said earlier, it was great fun writing for Herald and Newsline. It was while it lasted. Good for last. I celebrate. I am very happy that I wrote in those newspapers.
Let's open the floor for questions because we don't have as much time. Should we pass? Should we introduce ourselves? Maybe that would be interesting because.
My name is Shahid Zahid. I just wanted to say something. You asked what were some of the good stories that we have to share from those early days. From my perspective, I think one of the best things that both Herald and Newsline did in the early days, and well, the days when I was writing for them, was that they invited academics and outside people to contribute. And there was no restriction on what we wrote. I used to write practically a monthly article for the Herald for many years. They never told me what I could write, what I could not write. They gave me freedom to write whatever I wanted to write about. I used to write about social issues, political issues, anything I wanted. I could criticize the government. I was working as an academic. I was not allowed to write because there were laws preventing academics from writing under their own names. But they insisted on publishing my work under my name, and they gave me all the support. So that's something that I've always been grateful for. Thank you. Not a question, just a comment.
That's okay, we'll allow that. Anyone else with any questions?
Yes,
I think Mariam Chaudhry there has a question. Will someone give her the mic? Oh, I'm sorry. You want to go first since you have the mic? Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll put...
I'm Farhan Bukhari, journalist by profession. Too often we've heard in the last few years that the space for long-form journalism is practically dying. The kind of long-form journalism practiced by Herald and Newsline. But isn't this the case that essentially it's not that the appetite has vanished?
Do you have a question?
Well,
Okay.
that is precisely the question. Isn't it the case that news organizations of today have made that choice because shorter journalism, whether it's the broadcast equivalent or print, is easier and in some ways maybe more cost effective. Dawn still does, as you mentioned, long-form journalism, investigative pieces like the one on the kidney trade or the real estate ASF scandal in Karachi.
Are you asking us whether? Are you asking a question?
This is the
Yeah,
question.
whether-
The appetite is still there,
Okay.
but it's just that news organizations have practically, in part, abandoned their commitment to good quality long-form journalism.
Okay. Should I assign? Talat, do you want to take that question, or Tehmina? Tehmina, you want to take that question?
Well, in my opinion anyway, I don't think it's the news organizations. I think there is a difference in what the reader expects and what the reader wants. My opinion.
You know, I'll answer that question for you because you talked about the story in Dawn about the kidney trade and the various long-form stories. There may be a kind of readership that would go for that would drawn towards long form, but I think, personally, I think it's also, you need the resources for that kind to investigate that kind of long form journalism, and like our panelists were talking about fact checking, you need the human resources and you need the financial resources for long form journalistic. That's the reality of it, and I think that is something that is a challenge. as well.
Just very briefly, in these two cases, and there are many others, the pieces received a record number of hits online. You can go there, especially the kidney trade.
Right.
Which goes on to show that there is appetite from the readers. It's just that we are not doing enough of that.
I agree with you. I agree with you because I think there is appetite, and I think also it's the quality of journalism that's put out there. If the quality is good, personally, I think there will be a readership, and that is, with Dawn, the quality of that kind of journalism that you talk about is very much there. It's very strong. It's like, you know, world-class quality. It's just that if there were resources, and if we had human and other resources, I think it could double the amount of that kind of journalism. Should we give the mic up there?
Hello. My name is Mariam. I'm a senior executive producer at Geo News for the past 12 years. I say this because my question is a bit strange. I'm not belittling censorship. I'm saying obviously it exists. I've worked through it for the past 12 years as well. Recent times it's very high. But let's say there wasn't any censorship. Do you think the quality of investigative journalism, especially with the news as well, does it stand up or does it have the same potential that it did when aap log Herald or Newsline kar rahe the? Do you think that same quality has gone up or is it actually gone down despite censorship? It can be other issues, kidney trade that we spoke about.
Rehman Saab, will you take that question? Rehman Saab, will you answer that question?
रहमान साहब censorship के बारे में बोल रहे हैं.
जी
Our question को answer करेंगे?
क्या है?
Mariam, do you want to repeat your question? Your question. उनको mic दे दें.
I couldn't hear.
Will you give the mic up there so we can hear the question again?
रहमान साहब, अगर censorship पाकिस्तान में भी नहीं होती, क्या investigative journalism जो आप लोगों की quality उस वक्त थी Herald and Newsline की, would it be sustaining itself? Would there be the same standard of investigative journalism जो आपके वक्त में थी?
The question, Rehman Saab, is that if there was no censorship, would the type of stories that are done today, are they good enough? Would they sustain? If there was no censorship, are they good enough? Do we do those kind of stories?
I believe if there is no censorship, there will be confusion for some time, but better stories will come out.
I'm not sure you got your answer, but it's a good answer.
I'm opposed to any form of censorship because it kills your creative instinct. It distorts your vision. It cushions you against everything. Let us see, because the problem in Pakistan is that there is so much thought control. There is no discourse. We are not allowed to discuss anything. Parliament doesn't discuss law, people don't discuss law, we don't discuss our problems, we don't talk to another, there is no dialogue. What are we going to do? Let us be free.
Rehman Saab said very clearly that people have changed. At one point, a couple of other speakers mentioned that as well. If there was no censorship, you would have been able to adapt to the change in people. People change all the time. They're not static.
Absolutely.
The journalists knew how to inbuild that change into their writing. But what Rehman Saab is saying, which to me sounds like the bell of truth, that the ability to adapt financially, mentally, intellectually, all this
It's very much
is
there.
killed by censorship of the kind that is soul destroying, of a security that a man or a woman who's a journalist can't go to their home without fear of being picked up, dragged into some, I mean, you are speaking of the recorded cases. I speak of the unrecorded cases where the people, the journalists have been humiliated so much that they even fear to tell the truth. These people are more symptomatic of the way that fear has been built in, the terror. If you're an honest journalist, you're going to go back on a motorbike or a small little dinky car. Zayed drove a dinky car for most of his life as a journalist.
That's what I said.
You would be driving on that slow road back through Lalu Khet, into Nazrabad, into those areas, into water pump, and someone is going to beat the shit out of you.
That's exactly what happened to Wali Babar.
There's no security.
Yes, you're right. Any other questions? I think we're past our time, so let's take, how many do we have? Do we have time?
If there was no
Okay,
no censorship,
let's give them the mic there.
if there was
Let's not have a statement. Let's have a quick question so it could be answered. We'll try and get in two questions.
if there was
इनको mic
if
दे
there
दें,
was
ये
no
बहुत पहले से उनका हाथ.
censorship, this would be like Britain, like England.
इनको mic दे दे.
Sorry.
Just give us one question quickly so we can get
Okay,
in one
very
more.
quickly, I just want to say that in my very short and modest experience, I've realized that journalism is not a service or product that people want to pay for.
What's your
anymore.
question so we can get another one in?
Has media groups, have they done enough to sort of be ahead of the curve and transfer into the digital sphere?
Talat, keep that question in mind and take that question. Let's take one more. Okay, wait, hold on.
सर जो सहाफ़ी
Talat,
बोल्ड
that's
होता है,
your
जो
question.
सहाफ़ी बोल्ड होता है, जो बेलौस होकर काम करता है हामिद मीर की तरह, उसको कराची में जाकर फायरिंग की गई, गोलियां भी मारी गई, और सलीम साफ़ी को भी काफ़ी थ्रेट्स मिलते हैं. और सरमत खुसर की ऐसी फिल्म थी जो कि पाकिस्तानी सिनेमा
What's
में,
आपका question?
मेरा क्वेश्चन बस ये है कि पाकिस्तानी सिनेमा की रिवाइवल होनी चाहिए और हामिद मीर जैसे सहाफ़ियों को मौका मिलना चाहिए कि वो हर प्लेटफॉर्म पे आकर बात कर सकें.
Okay, thank you. माइक पीछे दे दें इनको.
My question is, why most of the governments are a bit more tolerant when it comes to criticism by the English mass media as compared to the criticism by Urdu mass media, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Talat, you want to
Well,
take
it's
that
obviously,
question, and
it's
Zaid Saab
obviously
want to take
true
the other question?
because it reaches a much larger audience, and they can the Urdu media or the electronic media reaches a lot, and the English media reaches a very small. But increasingly, they've become even nervous about the English media because the small number of people who read it are influential, small but influential people. Actually, the Herald and Newsline actually thrived also because of that reason, because even during Zia-ul Haq's period, when there was censorship in other papers, newspapers and the rest, the English and a small magazine like Herald Newsline, they allowed it to carry on because they thought it wouldn't make much of a difference. So for the same reason, yes or no, I don't know if it does, but they think that the Urdu media makes much more difference, and they're much more sensitive of what goes on air on the electronic media and in Urdu media.
Thanks, Talat. Zaid Saab, you want to take that question?
Well, actually, I think probably it's very clear that now television are under threat much more, is much more censored. But the worst thing happened during this period is that they have created a new breed of journalists who would justify everything what they did, and it did not happen before. Like even in Zia-ul Haq's time, actually, more or less journalists were united against the atrocity or the press censorship at that point. But now, actually, you will find actually the anchor person or the television actually defending those actions against journalists. And that is basically worst thing happening.
In fact, panels have to have one such person now.
There's one difference that has happened. The difference is,
उनको mic दे दें.
in Zia-ul Haq's time, the model used to be कि अंग्रेजी प्रेस का मॉडल और उर्दू प्रेस का मॉडल मुख्तलिफ है. The constant complaint from 2010 onwards is this, that papers like Dawn, which means young, mainstream papers, whether in Urdu or English, set the agenda for the entire television news, the agenda, not the contents.
Yes, yes.
For the entire television news and for the spread of .com news. That terrifies them.
Like for example, this about Dawn, and you will find actually about 3 or 4 or 5
Zaid Saab, use the mic.
person defending those actions.
Mic so they can hear you.
Oh, sorry. What I'm saying actually, those kind of actions against Dawn, for example, you will find like 5 or 6 journalists, not journalists actually, anchor person defending government action. In fact, actually they have been used now increasingly used by the establishment to attack press. And that's the worst thing happened, which is never...
That has been going on for a while, I mean, a couple of years. I mean, we've been seeing it on television. We see horrible caricatures of journalists put there on TV. It's their breaking news on certain channels to go after journalists.
एक छोटी सी बात, नवाए वक्त और जंग अखबार को हम एक बायस, जंग अखबार जो ऐसा, जंग अखबार ऐसा अखबार है जो कि हुकूमत के साथ चलता है, और नवाए वक्त हमेशा PMLN का हामी रहा है, और आइए रहमान साहब और
आपने बोल दिया, अब आप माइक दे दें।
बस एक छोटी सी बात,
आपके क्वेश्चन नहीं है, क्वेश्चन ना हो तो स्टेटमेंट
नवाए वक्त हमेशा नवाए वक्त
बस आपने बोल दिया। Thank you. Thank you very much everyone for coming. We've run over time. Thank you Talat, Zahid Saab, Tehmina and Rehman Saab for your insight. Thank you very much.